April 1st, 2026. At 6:35 p.m. Eastern Time, from Launch Complex 39B at Kennedy Space Center, NASA's Space L Launch system rocket thunders off the pad, carrying the Orion spacecraft and 4 astronauts: Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, Miss Science specialist Christina Koch, and Canadian SP ACE Agency mission specialist Jeremy Hansen, farther from Earth than any human being has traveled in more than 50 years. This is Artemis 2. No landing this time. That comes later with Artemis 3. This is a 10-day flyby, a loop around the moon and back, designed above all to prove that Orion, its life support systems, and its crew can survive the journey. But somewhere in that 10-day arc, as the spacecraft slips bay on the protective bubble of Earth's magnetic field and into the raw environment of DAP space, the mission quietly confirms something scientists, 2's, have worried about for decades. Something that doesn't show up in the mission photographs, doesn't make for a dramatic headline in the moment, but may turn out to be the single most important discovery to come out of the entire flight. Exactly how deadly the space between Earth and the moon really is. This is the story of Artemis 2's deadly discovery. Not a monster in a crater, not an alien signal, but something far more real and far more dangerous. Radiation. To understand why Artemis 2's radiation data matters so much, you first have to understand just how long it's been SC. Since human beings last left the protective shelter of Earth's magnetic field. The last time astronauts traveled beyond low Earth orbit was December 1972, during Apollo 17, the final crewed lunar mission of the 20th century. Since then, every single crewed spaceflight, Skylab, the Space Shuttle program, and more than 2 decades of continuous operations aboard the International Space Station, and has stayed within a few hundred kilometers of Earth's surface, comfortably tucked inside the protective cocoon of our planet's magnetosphere. That magnetic bubble, generated deep within Earth's molten core, deflects the overwhelming majority of dangerous solar and cosmic radiation long before it ever reaches astronauts in low orbit. The moon offers no such protection whatsoever. It has no meaningful magnetic field of its own, and neither does the vast, empty stretch of space between the Earth and the moon. Once a spacecraft leaves the safety of Earth's magnetosphere behind, its crew is directly, continuously exposed to the raw radiation environment of deep space. The very same environment that any future astronauts traveling to Mars would eventually have to endure for a journey measured not in days but in months. For more than 50 years, humanity's entire understanding of what that exposure actually does to a modern human body rested almost entirely on data gathered during 9 Apollo missions, flown with instrumentation that, by today's standards, looks almost primitive on astronauts monitored. With the comparatively crude biomedical tools available in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Artemis 2 represented the first real opportunity in half a century to gather modern, detailed, high-resolution radiation data on an actual crewed mission traveling beyond Earth's magnetic shelter. And what it found reinforced in precise, quantifiable terms just how seriously that threat needs to be taken as humanity prepares to go back, and to stay longer this time. The danger begins almost immediately after launch, long before Orion ever reaches the vicinity of the moon itself. Surrounding Earth are 2 donut-shaped regions of intense, trapped radiation known as the Van Allen belts, first discovered by American physicist James Van Allen using data from Explorer 1, the United States' very first satellite, launched all the way back in 1958. These belts stretch from roughly 600 kilometers above Earth's surface out to around 60,000 kilometers, well above the altitude where the International Space Station orbits, and squarely in the direct path of any spacecraft headed toward the moon. The Van Allen belts are filled with high-energy charged particles, trapped and held in place by the shape of Earth's magnetic field. Particles that behave almost like subatomic shrapnel, capable of shredding through soft biological tissue and delicate DNA structures at the molecular level, leaving behind a trail of damaged cells and unstable reactive ions in their wake. Orion's trajectory takes it directly through these belts on the way out toward the moon, and again on the return journey home. A necessary but genuinely hazardous passage that no spacecraft had carried a living human crew through since the final Apollo missions concluded more than 5 decades earlier. To monitor exactly what the crew experiences during this passage, and throughout every subsequent stage of the mission, Orion was equipped with an unusually extensive radiation monitoring system for a vehicle its size. 6 separate hybrid electronic radiation assessors, instruments, known within NASA by the acronym HERA, were positioned at carefully chosen locations throughout the capsule's interior, alongside individual crew active dosimeter badges worn directly by each astronaut, continuously tracking their personal radiation exposure in real time, moment by moment, throughout the entire 10-day journey. This wasn't simply a safety precaution bolted onto the mission as an afterthought. It was also, quietly, one of the most scientifically valuable experiments carried aboard the entire flight, arguably more valuable in the long run than many of the mission's more publicly celebrated objectives. Here's where the story becomes genuinely tense. Artemis 2 launched during a particularly unfortunate stretch of space weather, one that mission planners had been watching closely for years in advance. The mission flew in the unsettled aftermath of solar cycle 25's maximum, the roughly 11-year cycle of rising and falling activity the sun continuously cycles through, driven by the slow twisting, buildup, and eventual reversal of its own magnetic field deep within its interior. Near solar maximum, the background level of galactic cosmic radiation, a slow, chronic drizzle of extraordinarily high-energy particles arriving from far outside our solar system entirely, born in the explosive deaths of distant stars, supernova remnants scattered across the galaxy, actually drops somewhat during this phase of the solar cycle, because the sun's stronger NERA, or active magnetic field during this period, helps deflect a portion of that incoming galactic radiation before it reaches the inner solar system. But that small silver lining comes at a genuine, steep cost. Solar maximum also dramatically increases the odds of a sudden, violent solar storm, a coronal mass ejection, or an intense solar flare, capable of hurling a wave of high-speed charged particles across the solar system with essentially no meaningful advance warning. Lunar surface stays currently being planned for later Artemis missions, and an entirely different proposition, a gain from the years-long round trip that a future crewed Mars mission would inevitably require. Among NASA's own official list of health hazards facing deep space astronauts, radiation consistently sits at the very top of the list, repeatedly ranked by agency researchers as the single greatest unresolved medical challenge facing any mission that ventures meaningfully farther or stays meaningfully longer than Artemis 2 ultimately did. Researchers dying this specific issue have been direct about why the concern runs so deep. As mission durations gradually stretch from days into months and eventually into years for a Mars mission, radiation exposure stops being a brief, tightly bounded, and manageable passing risk, and instead becomes something closer to a chronic, ongoing companion throughout the entire journey, one whose full cumulative effects on the human body current medicine still doesn't completely understand, even after decades of dedicated research. There's also a longer-term, more sobering thread running quietly through this entire body of research, one that connects directly back to the original Apollo astronauts of the 1960s and 1970s. Some researchers studying the surprisingly small surviving pool of Apollo lunar astronauts. The small handful of men who genuinely flew beyond Earth's magnetic shielding decades ago, further than almost anyone else in human history, have suggested a possible statistical link between their blood vessels over subsequent decades. It's important to be genuinely careful here, and responsible researchers themselves are careful to say so. The sample size involved in these particular studies is extremely small, amounting to just a handful of individuals in total, and the broader scientific community continues to actively debate exactly how strong or how reliable this specific proposed link really is. But it's exactly the kind of long-term, delayed, difficult to fully verify consequence that short-term radiation dose numbers, taken entirely on their own, cannot fully capture. And it's a large part of why NASA treats every single additional data point gathered from missions like Artemis 2 as genuinely precious, worth an enormous amount of engineering effort and mission complexity to obtain. This is ultimately why Artemis 2's radiation findings matter so much more than they might initially appear to on the surface. NASA has been explicit in its own public mission materials that Artemis 2's broader science operations exist specific, ally to lay the essential groundwork for safe, efficient human exploration much further out. First, back down to the lunar surface itself with the upcoming Artemis 3 mission, then toward establishing a genuinely sustained human presence on, and around the moon in the years that follow, and eventually, much further out still, toward the far greater challenge of sending astronauts all the way to Mars. Every additional data point gathered during Artemis 2, the precise, location-specific shielding performance measured at multiple points throughout Orion's interior, the detailed biological response captured directly within astronaut bone marrow tissue and circulating immune biomarkers, the astronaut's own continuous physiological readings, gathered throughout a genuine 10-day passage through deep space, feeds directly and immediately into the engineering decisions and mission planning choices that will shape every single Artemis mission that follows this one. It helps NASA engineers determine precisely how much physical shielding future lunar landers and surface habitats will actually require. It helps refine exactly how future storm shelters should be designed, positioned, and stocked. And it helps Mission P planners set genuinely realistic limits on how long astronauts can safely remain down on the lunar surface, or eventually en route to Mars itself, before cumulative radiation exposure becomes a hard, unavoidable limiting factor on the mission's total achievable duration. In that sense, the real deadly discovery of Artemis 2 was never a single dramatic moment, a shocking anomaly buried somewhere deep in the data, or some hidden lunar mystery waiting to be uncovered. It's the sobering, carefully quantified confirmation of something scientists have long suspected in theory, but had never before been able to properly measure with genuinely modern instrumentation of a real living human crew, that the environment stretching between Earth and the Moon is genuinely, measurably hostile to human life, in ways that are both immediate. A severe solar storm capable of delivering a dangerous, potential, even fatal radiation dose within a matter of hours, and gradual, cumulative, and only fully visible across an entire lifetime of careful patient medical follow-up study conducted over many decades afterward. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen flew directly through that hostile environment, shielded by nothing more than the walls of a single spacecraft, farther from home than any human being had traveled in 50 years, and ultimately returned safely to Earth, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego after their historic 10-day journey. In doing so, they quietly delivered exactly the kind of unglamorous, deeply essential scientific date. That will help keep the next generation of astronauts alive as humanity pushes steadily further outward from home, first to establish a lasting presence on the Moon, and eventually, years from now, to make the far longer and far more dangerous reach toward Mars itself. The Moon, it turns out, doesn't need monsters, buried secrets, or dramatic mysteries hidden in its craters to be genuinely dangerous. The real dough, Magur, was always there, invisible, surrounding the entire journey from the very first moment Orion left the protection of Earth's magnetic field. And thanks to Artemis 2 and the quiet, careful work of everyone who designed its instruments, humanity finally has the modern, detailed data it needs to actually understand that danger and to prepare properly for whatever comes next. For astronauts safely tucked inside Earth's protective magnetosphere, even a powerful solar storm is mostly just a spectacular visual event, driving vivid, sweeping auroras across the night sky. For astronauts traveling beyond that protection, however, a severe solar particle event becomes a genuine, potentially life-threatening emergency. Space scientists who study this risk closely have been remarkably blunt about the stakes involved. An unusually powerful solar storm, striking an unshielded Rue at precisely the wrong moment during their journey, is capable of delivering a radiation dose that could prove fatal or come uncomfortably close to it within a matter of hours rather than days. NASA didn't launch Artemis 2 blind to this risk. Far from it. Mission planners built extensive real-time space weather monitoring directly into the mission architecture, and Orion itself carries a dedicated storm shelter, a section of the capsule positioned near the spacecraft's heavily shielded floor, owes to the heat shield, widely considered one of the best protected areas of the entire vehicle. In the event of an approaching solar storm, the crew would retreat there and use additional stowed equipment, including dense storage lockers, arranged as improvised extra shielding around their bodies. Had Artemis 2 actually encountered a severe solar particle event during its 10-day flight, the crew's survival would have depended directly on how quickly they could reach that shelter, and on how effectively that largely theoretical improvised shielding strategy actually performed under real conditions, something that had genuinely never been tested on a real, crude deep space mission before this flight. As it happened, Artemis 2 did not encounter a major solar storm during its actual flight window, but the mission still delivered exactly the kind of data scientists urgently needed regardless, a full, high-resolution map of what a comparatively quiet, uneventful 10-day journey through deep space genuinely costs the human body, even in the complete absence of a worst-case scenario ever unfolding. So what did Artemis 2 actually discover? The headline finding, based on the mission's full radiation monitoring data, is that the total dose the crew absorbed during their roughly 10-day journey around the Moon and CK was, in absolute terms, relatively modest, broadly comparable to the radiation dose received during a single whole-body CT scan here on Earth. That's of detail, a far more precise, real-time location-by-location map of exactly how radiation exposure varies throughout an occupied spacecraft during a genuine translunar journey than anything scientists have ever had direct access to before. Because the 6 separate HERA sensors were deliberately positioned at different points throughout Orion's interior, researchers back on Earth received, for the very first time, a genuinely detailed picture of exactly how much shielding actually matters, moment to moment, depending on precisely where inside the spacecraft a given crew member happens to be at any given time. Areas positioned near the heavily shielded floor and heat shield consistently showed meaningfully lower radiation exposure readings than more exposed positions elsewhere throughout the cabin. Direct, real-world, flight-tested confirmation of exactly the kind of shielding strategy that engineers had, until this mission, only ever been able to model theoretically, using computer simulations and ground-based testing alone. Beyond simply counting raw particles, Artemis 2 also carried a suite of biological experiments specifically designed to look past the raw radiation dose numbers entirely and examine what that radiation actually does at a cellular level to living human tissue. One particularly ambitious experiment, flying small laboratory-grown or GAN chips cultured directly from bone marrow cells donated individually by each astronaut before launch, aimed to study precisely how deep space radiation affects bone marrow specifically, a tissue that plays a central role in immune function throughout the human body, and one already well known to be particularly sensitive to radiation damage. Alongside this bone marrow experiment, the crew provided ongoing saliva and blood samples at regular intervals throughout the entire 10-day mission, allowing researchers back on Earth to track subtle immune system biomarkers directly and continuously, while a separate suite of experiments simultaneously monitored the crew's sleep quality, psychological stress levels, and cognitive performance under real deep space conditions. Taken together, these overlapping experiments built a much fuller, richer picture of how the human body actually responds to a genuine deep space radiation environment, not merely how many individual particles pass through the spacecraft's hull over the course of the journey, but what those particles actually do, biologically, once they arrive inside a living human body. One particularly striking, almost eerie detail reported directly by the crew themselves echoed something first documented all the way back during the original Apollo missions of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Several astronauts described briefly seeing mysterious, unexplained flashes of light behind their closed eyelids during the journey, especially in the darkened cabin. This strange phenomenon is widely believed to be caused by individual, extraordinarily high-energy cosmic ray particles passing directly through the retina at the back of the eye, triggering a genuine visual sensation even when the astronaut's eyes fully closed. It's a small, almost poetic reminder that all of this radiation isn't merely some abstract number scrolling across a dosimeter readout somewhere. It is physically, continuously passing directly through the astronauts' own bodies, cell by cell, for the entire duration of their time out there, whether they're awake, asleep, working, or simply looking out the window at the Earth shrinking behind them. It would be easy, on the surface, to walk away from Artemis 2's relatively modest total radiation dose and conclude that deep space radiation simply isn't as serious a threat as scientists have long claimed. That conclusion would be a serious and potentially dangerous misreading of what the mission actually demonstrated. Artemis 2 was, by design, a short mission. Roughly 10 days total, in and back out again with no extended stay in the deep space radiation environment, and crucially, no time spent down on the lunar surface itself, where future astronauts will eventually face even greater exposure with no atmosphere and no magnetic field of any kind standing between them and incoming radiation from every direction. Space Medi. ICEN researchers studying this issue closely have been consistently clear on one central point. Radiation risk does not scale in a simple, predictable straight line as mission duration increases. A short 10-day flyby like Artemis 2 represents a fundamentally different medical proposition than the months-long